Thanks so much, Eric. As Eric noted, just before starting my PhD in E-IPER, I watched the climate policy I'd spent the previous 3 years working on fail in front of the US Senate. As anyone that's familiar with that debate might understand, I was disillusioned by the failure of policymakers to address climate change. Out of this frustration, I became determined to find a more inspiring story for my dissertation. First, I wanted to turn my attention to a more direct interaction between society and the environment. Process emissions from cement plants just weren't doing it for me anymore. Secondly, I wanted to explore cases in which long-standing environmental degradation had been reversed. My hope was that such cases might provide useful guidance to improve the way humanity engages with the environment. These two criteria led me to the concept of forest transitions, shifts from extended periods of deforestation to periods of forest expansion. Many European countries and the US have gone through such a transition, as have a handful of developing countries such as Costa Rica and Vietnam. My own attention fell on Chile, a country whose forest transition had been largely ignored by my fellow scientists. As I've heard my colleagues present at lab groups and seminars over the past 6 years, I've learned a great deal about the changes taking place in many of the world's deforestation hotspots. It's these conversations that have shown me that the choice of Chile, while not a deforestation hotspot, was an incredibly lucky one. More and more, I've realized that the historical observations I've made in Chile might foreshadow larger shifts at the global level. So what are these trends that have been occurring at the global level? Here you can see two different parts of the Brazilian Amazon representing dramatically different patterns of deforestation. On the left is the archetypal fishbone pattern of deforestation, while the right shows large-scale clearing in Brazil's Mato Grosso. These two patterns highlight a variety of trends concerning deforestation that have emerged in the academic literature. First, the actors responsible for most of the world's deforestation have changed. Whereas much of the early research on deforestation was focused on the role of smallholders in colonizing frontiers, contemporary deforestation is more often the result of decisions made by corporations. So at left, you can see kind of small parcels being cleared near roads where smallholders move in. And at right, it's one large area cleared by a single actor, one corporation, clearing it for soy farming. The economic drivers that these actors are responding to differ as well. Whereas smallholders produced for local markets and responded to government colonization efforts, corporations are increasingly clearing land in order to produce commodities for global urban markets. As corporations have emerged as the dominant actors, there's also been a shift towards more industrial forms of production in cleared forests. Greater reliance on non-labor inputs and intensification of production in a variety of commodity chains, including timber, soy, and oil palm. Although the shift towards more global, corporate, and industrial clearing brings the risk of acceleration in deforestation, there is growing optimism that this change opens up new possibilities for stopping deforestation. In particular, there's been hope that the multinational corporations responsible for deforestation are both exposed to environmental demands from global consumers and uniquely positioned to slow deforestation at regional and global scales. Whereas government policies, such as the establishment of protected areas or the enforcement of deforestation bans, were once seen as the primary tools for conservation, a diversity of new policy instruments, including payments for ecosystem services and supply chain governance, have emerged. These new policies abandon traditional regulatory approaches and instead harness the global market forces driving deforestation to achieve conservation. It's hard to spend much time geeking out with Chileans about their forests without hearing this quote by Pablo Neruda: "He who does not know the Chilean forests does not know the world." Although Neruda was speaking of the biodiverse natural forests that span central and southern Chile, I'd argue that his quote is just as relevant when one considers the novel ecosystems that have emerged in Chile over the past half-century. Here you can see the border between two rotations of Monterey pine plantations and a natural Chilean temperate forest. In many ways, these forest landscapes have presaged and exemplified the trends seen at a global scale.
This meeting has ended due to lack of activity.
Well, we'll see if Suzi calls in later. So they presage and exemplify the trends seen at a global scale. First, Chile's forest landscapes are heavily influenced by corporate actors. Since the Pinochet regime's privatization of the forestry sector, Chile's forest landscapes have been heavily concentrated among a few large corporate actors. Arauco, Chile's largest forest landowner, also happens to be South America's largest forest owner. Only 3 of the world's 20 largest timber corporations are headquartered outside of the EU, North America, or Japan. 2 of those 3 are from Chile. In total, Chile's 3 largest timber corporations control 68% of all of Chile's plantations. Secondly, Chile's timber sector has historically been strongly influenced by global markets, and this influence has only increased over time. To the right, you can see the value of all production from Chile's forest sector divided into domestic consumption and exports. Although both have increased over time, the value of timber exports has increased 7-fold between 1978 and 2011. The ability of Chile to meet this growing global demand has almost entirely been met through intensively managed plantation forests. At right, you can see the important role of plantation timber, shown in red, in meeting total industrial timber production. Currently, more than 95% of Chile's industrial timber supply comes from plantations. Finally, Chile has been an early adopter of more market-based governance schemes to alter patterns of land use. For nearly 40 years and through political upheaval, Chile has maintained afforestation subsidies covering more than 75% of the cost of plantation establishment. For more than a decade, Chilean timber corporations have experimented with a variety of forest certification standards and voluntary governance agreements with environmental NGOs. So what do these forested landscapes actually look like? This is a nearly 30-year time-lapse of a 100 by 50 kilometer area in central Chile that's been largely covered by timber plantations. To a land change scientist such as myself, this is a particularly interesting image for a variety of reasons. It's an incredibly dynamic landscape. Within this one snapshot, we can see the clearing and regrowth of over 100 million trees. It's also incredibly productive. Each hectare of plantation produces more than enough timber to build a typical 2,500 square foot American house. And finally, it's not atypical. Eucalyptus and Monterey pine cover over 3 million hectares in Chile, an area the size of New Jersey. What we're currently looking at is just 5% of this total. I'd also argue that understanding the ecology, economics, and geography of this system is critical to understanding the future of the world's forests. So over the course of my dissertation, I ask 4 principal questions. What are the extent and patterns of forest cover change in Chile? How has plantation expansion affected the area of natural forests? How effective has supply chain governance been in stopping natural forest clearing by Chilean timber corporations? And finally, what are the impacts of Chile's afforestation subsidies on biodiversity and carbon sequestration? Due to the limits of time, I'm going to drop the last question and focus on the first 3 in this presentation. And we'll start with the first one. When I started my research, there were aggregate government statistics indicating that Chile had undergone a forest transition. However, there were no rigorous analyses of land cover conducted with the necessary resolution and consistency to clearly quantify and map this transition. Although the government claimed that forests were expanding, a variety of detailed regional analyses called these figures into question. As a result, I began my dissertation with a seemingly simple, yet incredibly time-intensive goal of determining the extent and patterns of forest cover change in Chile. I began by defining the bounds of my study area. Although I'll say Chile throughout this presentation, I'll largely be speaking about the part of central southern Chile, stretching from the Valparaiso region in the north to the Los Lagos region in the south. I chose to ignore regions further north due to the fact that excepting endemic palms, these regions are largely inhospitable to natural forests. To the south lies Patagonia, an archipelago of thousands of islands, generally unaffected by regular human use. What I'm left with is the vast majority of Chile's forests that are directly affected by humans. The data that I started with was a set of 15 Landsat scenes spanning the study region. At left, you can see what Landsat data looks like over a part of central Chile. And at right, you can see the footprints of each of these images over my study area. For each scene, I found a cloud-free image from each of 3 time periods, 1986 to 1987, 2000 to 2001, and 2010 to 2011. In order to classify these images into distinct land uses, I developed a partnership with Christian Echeverria's lab at the Universidad de Concepción. Together with a team of research assistants here in California, we randomly sampled more than 10,000 points scattered across the study region. Whether by jeep, bike, foot, or with the help of high-resolution Google Earth imagery, we identified the use of each of these points. The points were used for cross-validation of individual land use models for each of the Landsat images. All this effort allowed us to generate thematic maps of land use across the country. Of particular importance was the separation of plantations in red from natural forests in green to clearly track changes in both of these land uses across time. After aggregating several years' worth of effort, we're left with classified maps, look a little bit unimpressive at the end, across the study region for each of our 3 points in time. The overall classification accuracy for each of these 3 periods exceeded 86%. Since it's a bit difficult to see the actual land use change at the scale of the aggregate maps, let's look at the relative shares of land dedicated to each land use for the different regions at each point in time. We'll start with the northernmost regions of Valparaiso, Santiago, and O'Higgins. To the right, you can see the relative shares in each of the primary land uses. Regions are arranged north to south and are divided into 3 bars, one each for the land cover in 1986, 2001, and 2011. In the northern reaches of our study area, the majority of land is covered with Mediterranean shrub and agriculture. Net deforestation rates were low. When forest clearing did occur, it was typically due to degradation to shrub. Expansion of high-value crops such as avocados and grapes largely resulted in a loss of shrubland rather than direct conversion of natural forests. The central regions of Maule and Biobío are the historical centers for Chile's timber sector. This is evident in the large share of land dedicated to plantation forestry and the rapid expansion of plantations, especially in the 1986 to 2001 time period. It's no coincidence that these regions also experienced the highest rates of natural forest clearing. More than 16% of the natural forests that had been standing in 1986 were converted to plantations by 2011. In the 1990s, the Valdivian rainforest of southern Chile was seen as the next frontier for plantation forestry. Expansion of plantations into the forests of La Araucanía and Los Rios was rapid and an important cause of deforestation. In addition, large areas of forests were cleared for beef and dairy production. Further south, in the Los Lagos region, volcanic eruptions and forest fires were the proximate causes of the largest contiguous areas of deforestation. Throughout southern Chile, there was also large areas of forest regrowth, particularly in shrublands and marginal agricultural lands. Aggregating these different trends back to the national scale, we can track the changes in land use across each of the 3 points in time. Here I highlight the uses of land that were converted to plantations. We see that plantation area expanded during both periods. By 2011, the area of plantations had more than doubled to 2.8 million hectares, an area the size of New Jersey. Most of this plantation expansion occurred on agricultural lands. However, forests were not left untouched. 6% of the forests standing in 1986 had been converted to plantations by 2011. When we look at the changes in natural forests, we see that most deforestation was due to degradation to shrubs. Possibly hinting at the start of a forest transition, net deforestation rates were cut in half between the 2 time periods. To summarize these results, it may be useful to think of Chile's forest transition as more of a tree cover transition. The area of tree-covered landscapes increased, but this largely reflects the rapid expansion of plantations rather than natural forest regrowth. Secondly, although Chilean timber corporations often denied this, plantations were a proximate cause of deforestation. However, there is some room for optimism. Deforestation rates have slowed dramatically over this time period. So the last 2 observations from the remote sensing analysis hint at the complexities inherent in determining the impact of plantations on natural forests. The 2 uses compete for land, and as a result, plantations are proximate causes of deforestation. However, proponents of plantation forestry argue that it can reduce harvesting pressure on natural forests, sparing forests that would otherwise be cleared. This benefit to forests is often hypothetical. It's impossible to measure this effect through remote sensing alone. In order to better understand the net effect of plantations on natural forests, I chose to develop a new theoretical model to incorporate forest interactions through both land and timber markets. The theoretical model tracks land use allocation across 4 distinct uses: natural unharvested forests, natural productive forests, plantation forests, and agricultural lands. These 4 land uses generate 3 different goods: agricultural and timber products, as well as other ecosystem services. To determine what land use the landowner will choose, we look at the land rents, or profitability, of each of the different land uses as a function of the quality of the land. In this figure, we rank properties from low to high quality along the x-axis, then plot their rent to a specific use on the y-axis. Quality might be defined as distance to a market, as in the traditional von Thunen model of land use, or it could be a composite of multiple different factors such as slope or soil fertility. So here we can see that as land quality increases, the profitability of using that land for timber harvesting increases as well. It's worth noting that in each of the following figures, I show linear functions for simplicity's sake, but the results are robust to a variety of different functional forms. So we'll add the rest of the possible land uses to see each landowner's decision process a bit more clearly. Here we have agricultural rents in red, plantation rents in blue, natural forest timber rents in green, and then the natural unharvested forest rents in orange. Typically, we assume that unharvested forests will generate no or very low rents, while natural productive forests, plantations, and agriculture yield ever higher rents that are more strongly influenced by land quality. Each landowner will assess the quality of her land and then allocate it to the use that generates the highest rents. Thus, a landowner with moderate land quality will harvest timber in natural forests, whereas a landowner with low land quality will leave their forests untouched. Aggregating across all the landowners, we can see the allocation of land across the different uses, which we show here at the bottom. We can use this model to project how land use would change as a result of changes within the system. So let's consider a scenario in which a new highly productive plantation species is introduced to a country. The higher yields achieved in these plantations would increase the rents to plantation forestry and increase the area of plantations. This expansion would result in the loss of land dedicated to natural productive forests and agriculture. Previous models largely stopped at this point. I expand upon the existing models by incorporating demand for goods into the system. In my model, we can relabel our figure as the specific case where demand is perfectly elastic. A perfectly elastic demand means that consumers are willing to absorb any changes in the amount of timber being produced. As a result, the increasing area of plantations increases the quantity of timber produced, but it doesn't impact prices. However, this is only one specific outcome dependent on this specific form of demand. In reality, there's probably some inelasticity to demand. In this case, the increasing supply resulting from plantation expansion will also lead to lower prices for timber products. This feeds back to the rents to plantation forests, moderating the plantation expansion. In addition, since plantation forests and natural forests produce similar products, we'd likely see a decrease in the prices for timber from natural forests as well. As a result, rents to natural forests decline. This has the interesting result of increasing the area of forests that are left unharvested. So let's try to summarize these observations about the interactions between plantations and natural forests in a set of testable hypotheses. First, plantation expansion results in a contraction of natural forests dedicated to production. Second, plantation expansion leads to an expansion of unharvested natural forests. And finally, both of these effects dissipate as the demand for forest products becomes more elastic. Up to this point, I've spared you the mathematical equations I used to derive these relationships. However, in order to see whether we can empirically test these hypotheses, let's quickly translate them into equations. First, the derivative of the productive natural forest extent with respect to plantation extent is negative. Second, the derivative of unharvested natural forest extent with respect to plantation extent is positive. And finally, the cross-partial derivatives with respect to demand elasticity takes the opposite signs as the first derivatives. Now that we have clearly defined hypotheses, let's see if they're supported with empirical data. To do so, I'm going to take a step away from Chile and use data from global data sets on national level forest cover. Given that we have two different outcomes I'm interested in, the area of unharvested and harvested natural forests, I run two different sets of regressions, with each one as a dependent variable. Each of these variables is taken from the UNFAO's Global Forest Resource Assessment. Our independent variables of interest are annualized changes in the area of plantation forests and the elasticity of demand for forest products. Since there isn't any consistent panel data on national level demand elasticities for forest products, we chose to use trade intensity of forest products as a proxy. The logic for this decision was based on the idea that as countries become more involved in trade, their consumers have more substitute products to choose from. We'd expect that the increasing options available to consumers would increase the elasticity of demand for local production. Finally, we include fixed effects and a variety of additional controls to ensure our results are robust to other possible explanations. Here you can see the results of the three different versions of the model for each of the unharvested and harvested natural forest dependent variables at left and right. To quickly draw your attention to the key results, let's look at the final models for each of the two dependent variables. First, as hypothesized, the coefficient on plantation expansion in the harvested natural forest model is statistically significant and negative. In addition, the coefficient on the interaction effect between plantation area and trade intensity is significant and of the opposite sign. Similarly, the coefficients in the unharvested natural forest model follow the expected signs. Plantation expansion is associated with an expansion of unharvested forests, but this effect is less evident in countries with high levels of trade in timber products. So what conclusions can we draw from this research? First, plantation expansion is coupled with a contraction of natural forests dedicated to production. Secondly, plantation expansion is also associated with an expansion of unharvested natural forests. And finally, neither of these effects are guaranteed. Indeed, they're predicted to dissipate as the demand for forest products becomes more elastic. We can also reflect on these conclusions within the Chilean context. Given that Chile's timber sector is particularly trade intensive, there's little guarantee that plantation expansion would necessarily reduce pressure on unharvested natural forests through market dynamics. Intensive harvesting of natural forests throughout the 1990s seems to fit this conclusion. However, more recently, there has been a slowing in natural forest clearing. One possible explanation for this slowing in natural forest conversion was that in the early 2000s, the Chilean timber sector began to pursue sustainability certification and agreements with environmental NGOs. Such supply chain governance has received increasing attention as a possible tool for conservation due to high-profile examples including Brazil's soy moratorium and FSC certification. However, there has been little quantitative analysis of their ability to deliver on promised conservation outcomes. In this chapter, I sought to determine whether voluntary agreements by corporations can actually slow deforestation. So in 2001, the environmental NGO Forest Ethics placed this full-page ad in the New York Times. In the ad, they sought to alert American consumers to the impact of their purchases on Chilean forests. The ad states, "Take Chile's magical siempre verde, forever green forests. Many of these forests are being destroyed and replaced with legions of non-native plantation trees to produce cheap wood products for American homes. The forever green forest may soon be forever gone." The ad continues by asking consumers to use both a carrot and a stick to influence practices in Chile. First, they ask consumers to buy forest products from environmentally certified Chilean sources. In particular, the ad emphasizes forest stewardship, or FSC, certification. Secondly, the ad asks consumers to boycott uncertified forest products and insists that their suppliers use their influence to stop the conversion of Chile's native forests into non-native tree farms. The ad was extremely successful in capturing the attention of US retailers. Within a year, Home Depot convened Arauco and CMPC, the two largest Chilean timber corporations, and a variety of NGOs to negotiate an end to the campaign. In 2003, they all signed the Joint Solutions Project, an agreement to end all conversion of natural forests to plantations. When I first started reading about the Joint Solutions Project, or JSP, I became extremely excited about the opportunity to measure the impact of this agreement. Here you can see a timeline of the ad, the agreement, and the two periods of the remote sensing analysis I discussed earlier in this presentation. My remote sensing data provides clear pre- and post-treatment rates of forest conversion. However, the world is always more complicated than a social scientist would like. Concurrent to the negotiation and adoption of the JSP, there were significant changes to government plantation policies and certification standards. Here you can see a few of the government policies and private governance systems affecting Arauco in particular. In 1998, the government's subsidy program for afforestation was amended to increase incentive for smallholders interested in establishing plantations. Later in the talk, I'll discuss how I try to control for the impact of those changes. In addition, a variety of certification standards began to be adopted in Chile in the early 2000s. Cert 4 certification was a standard developed by the largest corporations in the timber sector as an attempt at self-regulation for environmental sustainability. In addition, several corporations began exploring FSC certification in the early 2000s. In the case of Arauco, they began a review of their operations for FSC certification in 2008 and received certification in 2013. Both of these policies included clear prohibitions on the conversion of natural forests to plantations. In this study, my goal was to measure the impact of the JSP and the certification standards on the rate of forest clearing. However, the multiple overlapping policies complicated any effort to clearly measure the effect of any individual policy. Luckily for me, the implementation of the different governance regimes was somewhat heterogeneous. By combining a dataset on property ownership with the information from corporate and certification system reports, I was able to identify which properties fell under the jurisdiction of each of the different governance regimes by 2003. Here I show the relative number of properties within the JSP in blue, with FSC certification in red, and Cert 4 certification in green. As you can see, we have a variety of properties affected by each of the different individual regimes, as well as many that are participating in multiple different programs. We take advantage of this heterogeneity to assess and compare the impacts of each of the different programs. Using my land change maps, I measured the annual rate of forest clearing for each property during the 2 time periods. Here you can see what this data looks like over a small part of the Andean foothills. Plantation forests are shown in shades of blue, while natural forests are shown in shades of green. The red areas are kind of the thing that we should focus our attention on. They're the areas where natural forests have been cleared to plantation, to be converted to plantations. You can see that for this particular region, there was a significant amount of natural forest conversion to plantations in the 1986 to 2001 period, but that this had largely come to an end by the 2001 to 2011 period. Areas outlined in black show one additional source of data, the boundaries of individual properties. I was fortunate to have access to government data on parcel boundaries, as well as the names of individual landowners. Using these names, I matched the individual properties to the parent corporations, and in turn, to the various policies that were affecting those properties. The dependent variable for the rest of the analysis is the property level annualized rate at which natural forests are converted to plantations. It would be a ratio of the areas in green, dark green, to those areas in red, outlined by a black line. So this is what that data might theoretically look like. 4 sets of observations on the rate of forest substitution, representing the controls in circles, the treatments in triangles, over each of the 2 time periods, left and right. My goal was to calculate the impact of each policy, also known as the treatment effect. By treatment effect, I'm just referring to a property that was affected by either the JSP or one of the certification schemes. The challenge arises due to the fact that the different governance regimes were not applied randomly across the different properties. Each corporation chose which treatment to pursue, and that choice might reflect the rate at which they plan to clear forests in the future. This is a common challenge for social scientists. Rather than working with a carefully controlled experiment, we're often forced to make sense of messy human interactions. In this study, I use a quasi-experimental method called match difference in differences to get the best possible estimate of the treatment effect, taking into account the differences between the control and treatment properties. To see why I believe my approach gives a valid estimate of the impact of supply chain governance, it's worth taking a few minutes to reflect on common methods employed by researchers to calculate treatment effects. In many cases, land change scientists don't actually have access to data from multiple periods of time. As a result, they often measure the impact of a policy by comparing properties that have received the policy to those that did not. However, as mentioned, the assignment to a treatment is rarely random, and due to correlations between the assignment process and the outcome variable, this will typically lead to a biased measure of the treatment effect. For example, early research looking at the impact of national parks rarely took into account the fact that national parks are often located in regions with lower background rates of deforestation, far away from urban areas. One method to minimize this bias is to match each treatment property to one or more controls that are most similar on a variety of observable variables. In our case, these might include the quality of the soil, the previous uses of the land, or the distance to urban markets. In order to combine all these different variables, we modeled the likelihood of each observation to receive treatment, called the propensity score, and then identify comparisons between treatment and control properties with similar propensity scores. Here we found one match highlighted in red. We repeat this process to find matches for all the treatment observations, and then drop the unmatched observations from the data set. The resulting comparison between the remaining treatment and control observations better reflects the true effect of the policy by controlling for the observable differences between the original treatment and control groups. However, propensity score matching can't control for unobserved differences between the treatment and control. In our case, these unobservables might include the preferences of an individual owner or the specific fertility patterns of a property. In order to begin to control for such unobserved confounding factors, researchers can take advantage of repeated observations before and after the treatment. In such a difference in differences approach, we create a counterfactual by calculating the trend among the control observations, and then compare this trend to the observed trend among the treatment observations to calculate the treatment effect. This allows us to remove the time invariant differences between the two groups, as well as the background trend in the outcome variable. Recent research has shown that the quasi-experimental method that best replicates the results of true random assignment experiments is one that combines propensity score matching with the difference in differences approach. So that's the approach that we take. First, we pre-process our data by conducting our match. Then we drop our unmatched observations. And finally, we calculate the difference in differences treatment based on this subsample. Although match difference in differences is generally recognized as the preferred quasi-experimental method to measure the treatment effect of a policy, data constraints has often limited the ability of researchers to follow this approach. Luckily, we have sufficient observations across time and information about the individual properties to conduct such a match difference in differences analysis. This is actually one of the first papers to use this approach looking at kind of supply chain governance. In particular, we take a three-step approach to measuring the effect of each of the non-state market-driven governance regimes. First, we pre-screen the properties to identify plantations. In addition, to account for changes in government policies that differentially affected smallholders, we drop any properties whose owners had less than 500 hectares under management. This is largely to control for that change in government policies that I mentioned at the beginning of this section. Next, we conduct our propensity score match. Our observable controls include a combination of economic variables, such as the rents to plantation forestry, biophysical variables, such as the capability of the land to support agriculture, and geographic information, such as the latitude and longitude of a property. Finally, we estimate the treatment effect by calculating the difference in differences. As I mentioned previously, measuring the effect of non-state market-driven governance in Chile is somewhat complicated by the overlapping policies that all took effect at a similar point in time. We adopt a method that's recently been introduced in education and labor economics to iterate through the different possible comparisons to calculate individual treatment effects, as well as compare the relative effectiveness of each of the different policies and determine whether there are any interaction effects by stacking the policies. So for example, by comparing properties that were under the jurisdiction of only the JSP to those properties that received no policy, we can measure the effect of the JSP. By comparing those that were only certified by FSC to those that were only a part of the JSP, we can look at the relative effectiveness of each of those two policies. And finally, by comparing those that were both FSC certified and members to the JSP to those properties that only participated in the JSP, we can begin to determine whether there are any complementarities in the policies that arise through stacking. This figure shows the raw rates of forest conversion before any matching. The different treatments are arrayed across the x-axis, and the annual rate of forest conversion is depicted on the y-axis. Dark green bars represent the 1986 to 2001 period, while light green bars represent the 2001 to 2011 period. Looking at trends for each group, we can notice that the rate of deforestation declined for each of the properties affected by one of the supply chain governance systems, while deforestation increased for the no policy properties. However, this comparison includes no controls nor matching. To get a more accurate estimate of the differences, let's use our match difference and differences approach to see what we find. For the next few slides, we'll group all of the properties affected by any of the governance regimes into our treatment and the no policy properties into our control. First, we conduct our propensity score match. This quantile-quantile plot is a common way to assess whether a matching attempt was successful. The axes depict our estimated likelihood of receiving treatment, the propensity score, for the treatment observations on the x-axis and the control observations on the y-axis. The individual points represent where each of the 100 quantiles fall in the distribution of these two variables. If points lie off the 45-degree line, this means that there is an observable difference between the treatment and the controls. In the unmatched sample shown in light green, the treatment properties have a predictably higher likelihood of receiving treatment than the controls. However, after applying our match, shown in dark green, this difference is removed. By combining this with other diagnostics, we can conclude that our match was largely successful. So given that our match was successful, let's see what difference in differences tells us about the impact of supply chain governance. Looking at the first differences, we can see that the rate of forest conversion accelerated in our matched controls, while it decelerated in our treatment properties. As a result, the difference in differences treatment effect is a decrease in the rate of forest conversion of 0.26 percentage points. This represents an 8 to 14% decrease in the deforestation rate, or interpreted another way, that 5,000 hectares of forests were conserved through these policies between 2001 and 2011. However, the policies sought to end all natural forest clearing. By this measure, the policies fell somewhat short. So those results compared any of the properties affected by supply chain governance to any of the no policy properties. We can repeat that process by comparing across any of the policies. For example, let's compare the JSP to CERT4 or FSC to the JSP. We iterate through all those possible options to generate this figure. Along the bottom x-axis are all the different treatments, and along the top x-axis are all the different controls that were used for comparison. We highlight the different controls in colors as well to just help with the interpretation of the figure. Along the y-axis is the change in the annual rate of deforestation attributed to the treatment. Just to orient you, here's the effect we just calculated by comparing any of the supply chain governance policies to a no policy control. An easy way to interpret the figure is that any points that fall below 0 indicate that the treatment achieved lower deforestation, while any points that fall above the line indicate that the control had the better outcome. These results indicate that all of the different supply chain governance regimes reduce deforestation rates when compared to the no policy control. That's that area you can see in white. In contrast, we are not able to identify many significant differences between the policies, nor many instances of complementarities resulting from combining the policies. To some extent, these results are to be expected. The different policies had similar goals, implementation, and enforcement, and thus we might not expect big differences across the policies. So what conclusions do we get from this research? First, both the JSP and the two certification schemes did reduce deforestation. However, compliance with the agreements was not perfect. Whereas well-enforced national parks often eliminate deforestation, these non-state governments regimes reduce deforestation by about 10%. You could also imagine that as a compliance of about 10%. However, the policies were successful in targeting high deforestation properties. It's worth remembering that these governance regimes reduce deforestation on properties belonging to Chile's largest timber corporations. In contrast, national parks are often located in areas where deforestation is less likely. Based off these two conclusions, it's reasonable to think that supply chain governance could be a good complement to traditional state regulations. And finally, there weren't significant differences between the regimes, nor many complementarities stemming from their interactions. So in thinking about my work as a whole, there are two policy-relevant results worth drawing attention to. First, although plantations do have the potential to reduce pressure on natural forests, this benefit isn't guaranteed. Policymakers need to assess the market dynamics in their specific case to understand the potential consequences of large-scale plantation forestry. During periods of rapid plantation expansion, policies that protect natural forests from direct conversion can help emphasize the benefits of plantations while limiting the associated negative consequences. Similarly, although supply chain governance can yield conservation benefits, it shouldn't be viewed as a panacea. Compliance with supply chain governance seems to be lower than under state-enforced systems. However, such non-state governance may better target regions that would be politically difficult to protect through government regulation. So I chose to work in Chile with the hope of finding inspiration in a positive story for humanity's interactions with the environment. Has Chile lived up to this hope? Well, just like every cloud may have a silver lining, a bright star also has its dark spots. Chile has seen an expansion of tree cover, but this is largely due to the expansion of monoculture plantations rather than natural forest regrowth. Nevertheless, deforestation has dramatically slowed over the past 15 years, and Chile's natural forests seem to be under less pressure than they've been in decades. Through a combination of government reforms, market transformations, and non-state governance, Chile seems likely to end deforestation. My own hope is that by clearly documenting this process, we can better inform ways to achieve similar transitions throughout the world. Thanks so much for coming, and I look forward to your questions. 43:30. So.
We have about 10 minutes or so for questions.
Can you just interpret for me, you said it looks like the policies have affected maybe a 10% reduction in deforestation, but then we saw a dramatic reduction, you know, in the snippets of 15 years prior to 2011 after. Is that a rate of change thing, or?
No, so kind of looking at two different things. The last paper that I presented looks at specifically how these supply chain governance policies affected deforestation. So there it's only a 10% reduction on those properties controlled by Arauco and CNPC and how they responded to the policies that they were adopting. The drop in, there was also a 50% drop in the rate of deforestation between the 1986 to 2001 period and the 2001 to 2011 period. And that's looking at the change in forest cover at kind of a national level. That's the result of all sorts of other policies. So there were policies that were implemented to conserve natural forests. That was a much more complicated story, which didn't really get into here. Yeah, David?
On the elasticity question, which is really key, and I think it's great that you carefully pull that out. But you don't actually measure elasticity, right? So
yeah.
Can you just talk more about that trade intensity proxy? Is there any evidence that that's a good measure of elasticity, or are there alternatives to it?
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about actually trying to measure. There are some data sets that you can use to look at elasticity for certain countries, and so I've been thinking about looking at how closely that trade intensity matches up with actual measured elasticities. My logic was largely, when we talk about a small open economy, we think about a country that doesn't have any price response. So no matter how much their producers increase production, the prices won't really change. And so that's a country that's open to global trade, and there's basically infinite elasticity. And so if we're using that kind of very fundamental economic logic, then we would think there would be that relationship, but I haven't actually empirically measured whether that holds. And I think that's something that would be worth doing.
I guess a related question is, if you think of the global land use sense, right, whether it's more or less elastic will determine the local land use implications, but it's also going to inversely affect the remote land use implications.
Yeah.
And in that, is there some sort of general conclusion you can reach about, at the global scale, regardless of what these cross-country elasticities are, there is some clear effect of implications?
Yeah, and I think that's something that It'd be interesting to go into a little bit more detail. In this case, I was just looking at kind of the country level responses in terms of land use, because trying to constrain it somehow to measure this empirically. I think it's hard to know exactly how responsive. I think it would depend on kind of a global elasticity and how global markets respond and how much they're able to absorb the excess timber production from plantations in what the net effect at global forest cover extent would be. But that's something I haven't really tried to tackle yet. But yeah, a lot of the work that kind of we were playing around with Tom Hurdle was similar, very related from an agricultural perspective. Dan.
So have you come from the policy world and done some work with a very real world policy implications? Have you had any thoughts about or done anything to actually bring it back to that world?
Yeah. Sadly, this spring's been really busy. I actually had a workshop planned with some of my collaborators down in Chile to start to present a lot of these results to the Chilean policy community. We're still talking about developing an atlas in Spanish to distribute to Chileans and basically make all of our remote sensing data publicly available there. I've been in conversations with a couple regional government officials who are really interested in the results for planning kind of park allocation and various conservation efforts there. And so they've been contacting me every couple of months, and I've had to tell them to hold off. And I think finally we're getting to the point where we can share that data. Hoping to carve out some time after the PhD to go back down there and share the results a little bit more directly. Noah.
Yeah, on the second chapter, the modeling, setting up the economic model, you talked about the kind of quality of the land, and it seems like, just thinking about California, we have a lot of examples where it seems like the market isn't really allocating use in the way you would predict given quality, like so alfalfa versus something else, for example. So does that, how much of that are you able to test those assumptions given the empirical data?
Yeah.
And what lessons do you have for the rest of the world?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the theoretical empirical models from that chapter were pretty separate. They were just basically coming up with the hypotheses and then testing those rough hypotheses using kind of empirics to come up with those same derivatives in the coefficients and then trying to match those up. There wasn't really a way to clearly test whether the von Thunen traditional model of land use allocation holds. I think that's a really valid question of whether these kind of fundamental economic models actually do a good job of determining allocation in land. In the fourth chapter, which I don't really discuss, I try to develop a more specific empiric model for Chile, where I am looking at the responsiveness of land use transitions to the rents to different uses. So I actually calculate plantation rents, forest rents, agricultural rents, pasture rents across the whole country, and then see whether those areas with the highest rents are actually allocated to each of those uses and whether you can use that to predict the conversions. And that's kind of a model that I think using the empirics gets you a little bit closer. It's based off the same idea that owners are going to allocate their land to the use that has the highest profitability, but you're estimating it off of the actual uses and values, and so you can see where that deviates. And I'm finding some deviation, definitely, but it does do a pretty good job. The rents are, positively correlated with conversions to that use. Fran?
I'm wondering when you do the physical matching to control for certain observables, is one of the observables you control for kind of the proportion of the property that's on kind of the remaining natural forest on the property can you control that?
So you can't control for anything in the post-treatment period, but you can control for that in the 1986 period. So what I do is the starting allocation, so the share of land dedicated to forests, plantations, and agriculture on each property. And so that is matched upon. Yeah.
I was wondering if each of the infrastructure interventions had similar structures on the ground in terms of what they were following. There are similar results apparently. Then do you have any idea of what were the reasons that they adopted different interventions in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, theoretically they're kind of different. And I think it's something that I want to dig in a little bit more. I kind of played down the fact that there weren't many differences. Partly that's also just due to the data constraints. In some cases, some of my treatments they only have 40 properties, 100 properties, and so you don't get a really good, if you're matching a group of 100 to a group of 50 and you're trying to find a good match, maybe you don't actually end up with a good match, and so maybe there is some difference. I think in a different setting, maybe with fewer different combinations of all the different policies, you might be able to, I think nobody has really done this in land change science, but I think a case where you have only 2 different treatments and to do the full factorial treatment here where you have a large group in each of those 4 groups that happen through the factorial, that might be the best case to actually measure how effective different policies are and when you stack them, but that's largely theoretical. In your case, I think part of the difference was that FSC certification is largely controlled by the NGOs. Cert 4 certification is largely controlled by the corporations. And then the JSP was a forced NGO agreement upon the corporations. So it was taking this more combative stance. And so the way that I think about the differences between each of the policies is basically cooperative versus combative on the part of the NGOs and the corporations. Whether the corporations are choosing to just go their own path with certification through Cert 4, whether they're choosing to collaborate with the NGOs through FSC, or whether the NGOs are just choosing to be very combative and they're kind of forcing some agreement upon the corporations through the JSP. And so maybe there you might actually expect some differences to come out once you frame it in that way, and it just didn't really emerge from my research, which was kind of a disappointment. I was hoping that there would be a difference, but didn't really emerge, which is probably a good thing. It tells you that there are more ways to get at the same result, that we don't need the NGOs necessarily hammering down the doors of the corporations, that in some cases they'll come to the table themselves and find ways to make real reforms.
Okay, time for one more question. Someone like to ask.
Yeah, Jan?
Do those certifications also get at practices in conditions, and is there any way or any data that you can use to test differences within conditions as well?
Yeah, so I mean, that's most of what those certification standards are. In Chile, they were kind of unique because they had riders that were added to the certification schemes to specifically focus on this conversion from natural forests to plantations. And that was an outcome variable that I had really great data on from the first chapter. So I chose to focus my attention there. There are other studies that have looked at the actual forestry management practices that are adopted, and how you'll often look at how many individual policies a company has adopted. I don't think anybody that I know of has kind of done a more holistic, you're actually measuring biodiversity and how that result, or there was one study that I can think of where they looked at biodiversity as a result of certification standards. But yeah, that's all data that I don't really have. You could imagine going in that direction and it'd be really interesting.
Thank you for questions. I think Bob would like to have the last one.
Yeah, there are just a couple really quick acknowledgements. First, funders. E-IPER has been incredibly helpful in funding a lot of this work and summer field research down in Chile. The Switzer Foundation and the NSF, as well as the Ishiyama Family Foundation and the Katz Family Foundation. All of my advisors and mentors. So top left is somebody you actually don't recognize, but this is Christian Echeverria, who's the partner I've had down in Chile, who's been incredibly helpful. Larry, I wanted to thank you for always pushing me to kind of focus a bit more on the policy side of things. I think in many cases I would start to go off on, as answering the question earlier, on more of a theoretical tangent, and being reminded to think about how these things are actually useful in terms of policy debates has been really helpful guidance. Eric, you've been an incredible mentor and good guide of how to balance life, do really amazing research, and yet still have the drive to go out into the mountains and get the most out of it. Chris, thanks so much for letting me participate in your lab group. It's been incredibly helpful, and everything from welding to all the native plants in Jasper Ridge, really awesome experience. Suzi's, really sadly, she couldn't join. I don't know what happened, but she opened up her house to me in New Zealand for several weeks while I was working with her, and also just an amazing person as a guide of how to manage life and work and do so much. And Nicole, thanks so much for agreeing to chair this. It kind of brings everything full circle by being able to see you and have you guide this conversation. It's really wonderful. I had a bunch of research assistants. These were the 4 primary ones. So Julie, Aleph, and Carla were all research assistants here in California. I would never have gotten through those 10,000 points without them sitting there for hours, rocking out in their headphones and identifying points for me. And then Rodrigo is kind of my counterpart down in Chile, we've spent a lot of late nights Facebook chatting and kind of keeping in touch on where the research is headed. All my colleagues in E-IPER, instead of risking leaving somebody out, I just did our big group photo. Everybody's been incredibly helpful, and I've had so many amazingly productive conversations with you all. And then outside of E-IPER, I'm lucky to be a part of multiple labs. I participated in, I think, up to like 7 different lab groups over my time here. But in particular, Eric, the land change lab group, everybody there has been absolutely insightful and really fundamental in me taking the research direction that I took. Thanks so much. And then I've had great communities. Actually, I see people from multiple co-ops that I've lived in. For me, kind of coming home to a place that's very supportive and filled with smiling faces has been a big part of the success that I've had. And then adventure friends, so many great trips into the mountains and laughs. And I wouldn't have been able to do this without their help. Finally, my family, my sister Linda, my dad Peter, and Claire. Thank you so much for coming out, and I really appreciate all your help and support over the last 6 years. It's been amazing. And even over the past month where I've gotten maybe a little bit uglier, it's been a little bit tougher to love me. Joan has been super supportive, and I just thank you so much.